بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه. السيد أمين سر الدائم لأكاديمية المملكة المغربية، السادة الزملاء أعضاء الأكاديمية، السيدة الأستاذة المحاضرة، حضرات السادة الأساتذة الأجلاء، حضرات السيدات والسادة، لقد سبق لأكاديمية المملكة المغربية في نطاق الإعداد للدورة 46 حول موضوع آسيا كأفق للتفكير المزمع عقدها بحول الله ما بين 9 إلى 17 دجنبر 2019، أن نظمت سلسلة من المحاضرات ألقاها مفكرون ومتخصصون في هذا الشأن، من بينها مكافحة الفقر في الصين، صعود الصين وتداعياته بالنسبة للاقتصاد والبلدان النامية، الحداثة المضغوطة، إنجاز تقابله مخاطر، تجربة كوريا الجنوبية ونتائجها بالنسبة للمغرب، نحو تنمية مستدامة لماليزيا. واليوم تتشرف أكاديمية المملكة المغربية في نفس النطاق أن تستضيف السيدة الأستاذة والصحفية الهندية والمعلقة السياسية شوما شودري، التي اختارت موضوع الانقسام الذاتي، حوارات الهند مع الثقافة، لتساهم به ضمن هذه السلسلة من المحاضرات. والأستاذة المحاضرة حائزة على عدة جوائز، ومعلقة سياسية ومحررة سياسية ومؤسسة ومديرة لشركة الملكية الفكرية Lucid Lines LLP. وفي عام 2011 اختارتها مجلة نيوزويك في الولايات المتحدة كواحدة من 150 امرأة تتمتع بقوة كبيرة تهز العالم. وفي عام 2018 دعيت لتقديم خطبة غاندي في سيدني، وهي أول هندية تقوم بذلك. حصلت السيدة المحاضرة أيضا على جائزة إرنست هيمنغواي المرموقة للصحافة السياسية، وجائزة نادي مومباي للصحافة السياسية، وجائزة رامناث غوينكا، وجائزة شاملي ديفي عن أفضل سيدة صحفية، كما شاركت في تأسيس وإدارة نادي الفنون والأفكار، وهو منتدى فريد من نوعه للمحادثات النقدية تم إنشاؤه لإطلاق أفكار جديدة ووجهات نظر غايتها التحدي. الكلمة للأستاذة المحاضرة، فلتتفضل مشكورة.
Good evening, everyone. It's an honor and privilege to be here. For me, Morocco embodies the excitement of travel. It's a culturally complex and layered society a gate between different continents, different ways of being. It's a country with personality. It's a place of discovery. So thank you very, very much for having me here. I'm here today to talk about a shared concern, the process of modernization of our societies. What upheaval do these processes create? What tension are they releasing in our society? When different forces in our countries pull in different directions, can we arrive at new ways to forge a path to modernity? Can we redefine what modernity means in our own contexts? Let me say at the very beginning that no matter how disturbing it can be sometimes, I'm very glad that the chemical equation between tradition and modernity in our societies is so complex. If there wasn't this clash, this creative churn and tension, we would all begin to look and think and behave exactly like each other. The modernity project would turn us all into a kind of homogeneous supermarket of identical humanoids, like breakfast cereals, just packaged in different nationalities. So it's very important that there is this tension, that there is this creativity. And the intellectual challenge in front of all of us is how can we create and manage the relationship between tradition and modernity in our countries and create an outcome that is both positive and suited to our own needs. The process of modernization has two aspects to it. There is the physical manifestation of modernity, the glitzy malls, the swanky autobahns, the highways, the glass and chrome buildings, large-scale industry. There isn't much dispute about this. All our countries want this form of development. Actually, this form of development itself is problematic. There are many issues that arise out of it. Issues of environment and sustainability, climate change, disruption, economic equity. And it's very important to remember that while we are all following this blueprint, it has huge impacts on the social psyche and emotional character of our societies. It creates displacement, it creates fear, and we have to create readiness in our society for this physical project of modernity. But I'm not going to focus so much on that today as the second aspect of modernity, which is our mental attitude. Modernity as we know it came out of the Industrial Revolution in Britain and Europe. It also came out of the Enlightenment and the Renaissance. The mental attitude that characterizes modernity is an emphasis on individual liberty, the right to dissent, an idea of freedom which will supersede the idea of the collective. It also involves a capacity for scrutiny, for scientific, rational scrutiny, a scientific temper. The attempt to transplant both the physical model of modernity as well as this mental attitude onto developing societies is creating a lot of dilemmas, a lot of tensions. Your own country is facing this. In its desire for modernity, there is a backlash of conservatism and Islamism. In India too, it has been a complex process. And today, my talk is about the split self and India's multiple dialogues with modernity and where that has got us today. The interesting thing about India is that in 1947, we made a tryst with modernity exactly as we made a tryst with democracy. Today, India is going through a very cacophonous and energetic reinvention. We are rethinking and redefining every aspect of our society: social, emotional, cultural, economic, political, every aspect of it. There is a kind of exuberance in our society, a self-assertion, a confidence. And yet, there is also darker impulses which are beginning to play itself out. as we're beginning to shrug off the old ideas of India that we inherited at independence, darker impulses in our society which were suppressed are also coming to the fore. And so where is India today in its road to modernity? India is a very ancient civilization, but it entered into a contract to become a modern nation in 1947. Overnight, at the moment of its independence, India converted itself from a poor, feudal, illiterate colonial society into a democratic republic, with equal rights, including the right to vote, granted to every citizen, irrespective of caste, class, creed, religion, or gender. In many ways, this is an absolutely miraculous experiment, perhaps unprecedented anywhere else in the globe. Even the most oldest democracies, Britain and America, did not dare to give the vote to every citizen overnight. It happened in phases. Blacks were left out, women were left out, working classes were left out. It was a process before every individual in those nations were entrusted with the vote. In India, on the other hand, by believing in the capacity of every individual to be a rational, thinking, informed being, capable of making enlightened choices, theoretically, India bungee jumped or leapfrogged into modernity in an instant, overnight. At another level, though, we arrived at modernity through a series of suppressions. This modernity project at independence was led by a class of intellectuals and elites who were groomed in British and European universities. So the nationalist project over the last 70 years had cut India off from many of its own cultural and emotional roots. In some ways, this was inevitable, because India's encounter with modernity really began with its encounter with colonialism. And that encounter was a very violent one. It was positive in many ways, but it was also violent in many ways. I was just sharing earlier in the evening this particular statistic, that when the British came to India 300 years ago, India was 22% of the world's GDP. By the time the British left, we were 2% of the world's GDP. That is the amount of wealth that the British took away from India. But what it also did was take away pride in our own culture and heritage. As I said, India is a very old civilization. It had a very rich cultural, literary, as well as political heritage. We had roots of modernity in our own society. But even as the colonial encounter helped us slough away or shed many regressive cultural practices, what it also did was create a lot of shame about Indian heritage in every other way. It created a loss of pride. India, therefore, did not evolve into modernity in an organic way. It did so through a series of split selves. Today, many of these ruptures have come to a head. Metaphorically, India is in therapy. It is seeking a new, more integrated self. It is talking itself out. Technology has accelerated this process in complex and exponential ways. Today, the mobile phone is in everybody's hand. The internet is available to everybody. So India, in a way, has leapfrogged again from an agrarian society into a postmodern technological society. Information is available to everyone. This is creating a massive change in psyche and aspiration and the national spirit. We have, in a way, bypassed the industrial society. And so the training of the modern mind has not happened in the same way as it happened in Europe. So this has created a new duality in our society. At one level, there is a great confidence, as I said, in exuberance, At another level, there is a rise of the masses in crude and uninformed ways. So before we examine this new identity with both its positives and negatives, perhaps it would be useful to understand how India got here in the first place. Back in 1947, at the moment of India's birth as a modern nation, there were three routes that we could have taken to modernity. The first was embodied by Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India. He was a grand man, a visionary, a man of great ideals. He was rich, he was elite, he was Western educated, but he loved Indian culture and he loved Indian heritage. He wrote a book, I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, called The Discovery of India. He wrote it while he was in jail, but it is a classic of its time. If you ever want to understand India, that's perhaps the first book to start with. But even though he understood India that well, the construct of modernity that he presented to India was a European one. He was inspired by social Fabianism and by British and European ideals of democracy and the Republic. He wanted to introduce into India the idea of a modern nation with a scientific temper, a nation where plurality and the idea of diversity would be enshrined into our very DNA, a country where minorities would feel secure and the state would keep its distance from all faiths. The second route available to us was that which was embodied by the Hindu Chauvinists, what we today call the Hindutva project. These were conservatives who fashioned themselves as cultural revivalists, but they drew their ideals from the Italian and Germanic idea of the nation state. They admired Hitler and Mussolini. They wanted India to be a majoritarian state with a majoritarian language and a majoritarian religion. They believed that 800 years of Muslim rule in India, followed by 300 years of British colonialism, had ruptured a golden Hindu past. They wanted us to claim that Hindu identity as the basis of nationhood. And the third route was that of Mahatma Gandhi and Rabindranath Tagore. They urged a new language, a modernity which would be drawn out of Indian tradition, slower, more organic, homegrown, and perhaps more sustainable, more rooted in the cultural fabric of the subcontinent. Both of them believed that the European model of industrialization and the nation state was not suited to India. Rabindranath Tagore, in fact, created a university called Shanti Niketan. It was an inspired idea, perhaps ahead of its time, because even while it observed modern values and ingrained the idea of individual liberty, it was rooted in Indian culture. It did not have the same knee-jerk shame and rejection of things that were Hindu and Indian in that university. They also believed that Indian nationhood needed to be more accommodative. Because we are such a diverse and plural country, we have more than 1,500 languages, 1,500 languages, more than 8 or 10 big religions, dialects, different strata of societies. They believed that Indian nationhood should be a kind of federation of subnationalisms, that it could be accommodative, organic, not one nation state. Gandhi also believed that our idea of modernity should stem from the villages, village republics, and move outwards from that. But that idea was rejected at the time of independence. For almost 70 years, in one way or another, it was Nehru's vision that prevailed in India. In many ways, this was fantastic because India built great institutions. It ingrained the idea of a plural and diverse nation into our very blood and DNA. It is very difficult now to displace that, even though we are going through a political phase where this is in jeopardy. But there are enough forces. That idea of democracy went down to the root. The idea of plurality went down to the root. And so in many ways, it was a very, very progressive and important direction that India took. Yet, it made two big mistakes. One, the modernity project not the democratic project, but the modernity project, stayed an elite phenomenon. All the cultural references for being modern was borrowed from the West. There was an almost automatic downgrade of anything that was Indian or Hindu as being non-modern, superstitious, or day class. You know, you had to know your European literature, you had to know your Western music. When you spoke of dissent, you spoke of Voltaire and Disraeli. You did not draw the idea of dissent from your own culture. And so what this did was that it made the masses, the rustics, feel inferior, degraded, and left out. They could never feel modern, they were never deemed modern. There was no emotional resonance for them in the ideal of rational modernity that was being preached to them. And finally, English itself was a huge class barrier. So the idea of modernity was located in the capacity to speak English, to vibe with things that were European and Western and American. And so in that way, it left a large majority of India out. The second mistake was that in trying to create a secular nation, a nation where minorities would feel secure, a cultural vacuum was built up. India is a country where faith runs very, very deep. Myths and metaphors breathe alongside science, technology, and commerce. It was very short-sighted to sideline this emotional wiring in our society. A blowback was inevitable. A smarter route to modernity could perhaps have been to reform the regressive aspects of cultural practices in India and magnify its positive aspects. We should have celebrated our festivals and our rituals in ways where our emotional character could have been kept intact. This would have prevented the masses from feeling that they were part of a faceless supermarket of modernity. In a faith-soaked country, secularism was an alien, emotionally dry concept. Instead of celebrating all faiths equally, instead of foregrounding and engaging with its positive aspects, the state stayed separate. At other times, because of partition and because India had been born out of such a violent rupture where Pakistan and India separated and Muslims felt insecure, a large part of the nationalist project was almost chivalrous in nature. It wanted to make minorities feel secure. But again, the mistake it made was not to draw Muslims into modernity, but to speak to the Maulvis and clerics and somehow locate them in their own cultural regressiveness. What this did was that it did not align those communities to modernity. And it also, whether misplaced or not, created a sense of resentment, an idea of appeasement in the majority community. A space was vacated where the Hindu chauvinists, who had laid suppressed for so many years, the Hindutva project could gain ground. Today, what was inconceivable, unthinkable 10 years ago has come to pass. The BJP, a Hindu right-wing party, is in power with an absolute majority. Led by Prime Minister Modi, a man who began his life as a tea seller, the idea of India and its path to nationhood and modernity is being redefined. Now, before we examine the tectonic changes and the complex and contradictory forces that have now been unleashed in our country, I'd like to set out the positives and negatives of where India stands today, or at least the positives and negatives as I see it. One of the most positive achievements of India as a nation, both in its project of modernity and as a society, is that in the 70 years since it became independent, there is one undisputable fact, that women in India must be free and equal. Women in India are independent. In most societies, the battle between tradition and modernity is usually fought over the rights of women, sexuality, love, freedom, what women can do and not do. In India, that battle has been fought and it has been won. In practice, we may have many miles to cover. We still have female feticide, the girl child is still discriminated against in terms of going to school versus the boy child. There's still dowry deaths. There's still low labor participation. There's still urban glass ceilings. There's high incidence of rape. There are acid burnings. In fact, in the last 10 years, almost 20 million women have dropped out of the workforce. But this is in practice, and it will take time for this to catch up. But in public articulation, in political consensus, it is undisputed that Indian women are the force of modernity in our country. They will be equal and they will be free. Anybody who stands against that is shouted down. When the Hindu right first came to power in the country, they attempted to create some campaigns against frivolous things like Valentine's Day, boys and girls holding hands in parks. They created this kind of frightening prospect of love jihad, where there were interreligious marriages between Muslims and Hindus. But they were shouted out. They were shouted down. They realized that there was no political purchase in the Hindutva project where women are concerned anymore. And so even that has gone quiet. In India, cinema is the true canary test. It is like a social barometer. Now, when you watch Hindi movies, or you put on the television, or you see Netflix serials, you will see what I'm talking about, Indian women in our culture. All our stories now are about women's empowerment. They're women proposing to men. They're women owning their sexuality. They're women going out to work. And they're women walking away from disrespect and disenfranchisement. So that is a very, very positive feature of Indian modernity. The second is technology has played a hugely disruptive role. As mobile phones and the internet has penetrated into every hand, information is now available, and restrictive social norms are no longer possible. Old-style parental and community control has become weakened. Women and girls are globally connected, the youth is globally connected, and they are hungry for modernity. They are earning and they're changing the rules. So the second positive in India is that it is shrugging off that neurosis of the colonial mindset. It is embracing its own identity with great vigor. There's huge self-confidence, there's hunger, good, bad, or ugly. This is healthy. We no longer are trying to ape European modernity. We are now coming to terms with our own homegrown version of what it is to be modern. If any society has to arrive at a lasting tryst with modernity, it has to arise out of this kind of authentic identity. It cannot be a borrowed language, it cannot be an elitist project. It has to have the embrace of the masses. The Nobel laureate Sir V.S. Naipaul once spoke famously of Indians as being mimic men. Today that no longer holds good. Whether on the global stage or back home, Indians are strongly signaling their arrival on their own terms. Unfortunately, not all of this is positive. India today is moving towards authoritarianism and majoritarianism. I spoke about the fact that we had cut ourselves off from our cultural character. Today, under the BJP and Mr. Modi's vision, we are not reclaiming the heritage of India, the high elite heritage, not the high literature, not the high culture, but it's a kind of political project. So we have processions where Lord Ram or other gods are celebrated with Kalashnikovs and guns, and it is an attempt to create dominance over other societies. We have a very problematic citizenship amendment bill, where today the whole idea of migration and refugees is seeking to be mediated through a new bill, which will give citizenship to any refugees who are Hindu or Buddhist or Jains or Christians, but not to Muslims. This is unthought of, unthinkable in the India of the 70 years that we have been independent. These are new and worrying trends. Also, India has always been a very noisy and argumentative political landscape. This is something we were proud of. It reflected our diversity. Today, much of that landscape is silenced. All opposition parties have been relegated almost to irrelevance. They have been deemed corrupt and they have been made irrelevant. Dissent is frowned upon as anti-national. The nationalist project has become supreme. There have been scores of incidents where minorities and Dalits have been lynched, and yet those of us who dare to speak about this are deemed to be anti-national. We are looked upon as those who are shaming India's reputation on the global stage. Artists, writers, directors, people who are speaking up for the old, plural, and diverse idea of India are being slapped with sedition charges for defaming the country. Journalists who speak up are again either the CBI or the Enforcement Directorate or the tax authorities are unleashed upon people. So while displacing the westernized elites, it is not that India has reconnected with its own rich classical cultural heritage. It has come up with a new hybrid. It is not even reconnected with the village genius as Tagore and Gandhi had advocated. New India, unfortunately, is not just anti-elite, it is also anti-knowledge. Sadly, the new identity that I'm speaking of, while it is exuberant and I continue to say it is positive, it is also crude and it is garish and it is gauche. If you switch on a television channel and you see the kind of reality shows that are going on or the social media influencers that millions of young people are following, those of us who thought of modernity as being an intellectual state of mind, a capacity for scrutiny and for information, would cringe. And yet, I think this is an important phase. As I said, we are now coming to terms with our own emotional wiring and seeking modernity through that route. It is a phase, and I think it'll move to more positive spaces. And finally, like many countries across the world, India is having to deal with a new irony, which is that we are democratically electing governments that are reducing democracy. It is very important for us to understand and question why that is happening. What is the fear? What is the desire in our societies, amongst our masses, for a reduced democracy? They don't want to bear the intellectual burden of dissent. They want to hand their lives over to a dear leader who will take all decisions on their behalf. They do not want to apply that most basic building block of modernity, which is a critical individual mind. Now, this is something we need to examine in much more detail. Why is this happening? What is this new India all about? First, interestingly, the BJP and the rise of the BJP is itself a split phenomenon, and I'm sure you'll find many resonances with that in Morocco as well. It tried to evoke cultural chauvinism. It tried to appeal to history and to the wrongs of the Muslim rule and British rule. But its rise actually is based on a shrewd and unprecedented use of technology, propaganda, social media, holograms, communication skills, and the promise of modernity. The old Nehruvian Congress, which had stood for the independence movement, now no longer seemed to promise enough modernity. What Mr. Modi did was to understand that there's a new class of people in India because of the education of these 70 years, because of technology, because of information. There's a new young electorate in India that is hungry for modernity and for consumerism. Mr. Modi understood that, and so his election campaign spoke in two tongues. It spoke of the glories of Hinduism and correcting historical wrongs, but it promised smart cities, bullet trains, jobs, efficient governance, Rafale fighter jets, and a bigger presence on the global stage. Often, the attempt to evoke a glorious past has become ridiculous. Mr. Modi's ministers have evoked our myths and metaphors from India's epics. We have a god which has a human body and an elephant's head. They speak of this as proof that plastic surgery existed 5,000 years ago. There's another myth about how 100 sons were born from a queen's womb outside of her womb, that she, it was like artificial insemination. They see this as proof that test tube babies existed 5,000 years ago. There are stories of flying chariots and weapons, amazing weapons in our epics. They see this as proof that we were airborne and that we had nuclear weapons before any other civilization. But merely to ridicule all this would be to miss the point. The BJP came to a brute majority. They've come to power with a brute majority because subliminally it has offered the possibility of integration. And I want to emphasize this point. Finally, as I said, that sense of a split self is coming together in a process of integration between India's emotional nature and its modern ambition. To be modern, you no longer have to deny your belief in myths or your pleasure in myths, astrology, superstition, and religion. Before we sent off our rocket to Mars, the scientists bowed their heads to a coconut. Now, these are things that would be unthinkable. But as I said, if the modern project can begin to acquire its own language, it will be more sustainable. The second big change going on in our country is that the physical aspect of modernity and development had displaced millions of Indians. They were uprooted from their village life and communities, a connection with nature and soil and harvest cycles, and they have been leapfrogged straight away into a consumerist and postmodern information age. So the agrarian imagination did not have a chance to evolve and go through the phases of industrial development that other societies, particularly in Europe and Britain, were able to. It was urbanized almost overnight. This had created its own ruptures. India has a very beautiful traditional aesthetic, beautiful crafts, textiles, architectural traditions. So this new, ugly, bling, garish, crude aesthetic that we now live with is actually an expression of modern ambition. It is not an assertion of old tradition. So Mr. Modi astutely called this the neo-middle class. This is Indian small town meeting New York and saying, I'm okay as I am, I'm good enough. So this bling aesthetic, this overtly religious symbols, gives this strata of society a sense of comfort, a compass. It allows them to participate in the project of modernity without feeling lost and without feeling second class. Mobile technology and social media has made them realize that they're not alone. The vast majority of India feels, thinks, and looks like them. The elite no longer need to mediate what being modern means. So this era is about the rise of the masses and their direct dialogue with modernity. Finally, Mr. Modi has spoken to the young and offered them pride, self-confidence, and hope by foregrounding his own story. A poor tea seller with neither Western education nor a command over English could rise to become Prime Minister of the largest democracy on earth. So when he held Mr. Trump's hand and took him around on that stage in Houston, you can imagine what resonance it had for the masses back in India. There are many exciting aspects to the changes in India today, and it is important that we acknowledge this and acknowledge what is invigorating even while we sift out what is toxic. So the most disturbing phase of this new phase of modernity in India is not the resurgence of religiosity or cultural practices, not even the garish aesthetic. It is the acceptance of hyper-nationalism, authoritarianism, and the erosion of dissent. In essence, Hinduism is an individualistic religion and philosophy. It does not emphasize the collective. Its spiritual practice is about each soul making a solitary journey back to merge with the universal energy. So why then is there such an emotional buy-in for hyper-nationalism among Indians at a time when the Hindu majority is on the rise? Why is that psyche of the individual journey not merging with the nationalist project? My hunch is that this too is a product of India's dialogue with modernity. Indians have always had a huge piety about the family structure. In the past, all individual dreams, sexuality, love, ambition, the right to work, everything was subsumed to the idea of the family honor, family reputation. That was a kind of anchor for people. Today, that no longer holds good. personal space has opened up. As I've been explaining, the youth are hungry for personal actualization. So those individual happiness now matters more than family diktats. But that essential way of thinking has not really changed. People still want to anchor themselves to a larger idea. They fear being completely atomized and alone and individual without any larger idea to hold on to. So to my thinking, Mr. Modi has skillfully intuited this and replaced the idea of an individual family with the larger family, which is the nation. Now, Indians are willing to sacrifice many freedoms to serve the nation, to protect its reputation and honor. The Prime Minister is the new patriarch. Personally speaking, for me, this is the most disturbing aspect of our new dialogue with modernity. So are we finally set on this path of increasing authoritarianism? Will this continue to expand, or is another route possible? There have been so many fast-paced changes in India in the last 5 years that liberal elites are in a state of shock. But ultimately, all politics is about storytelling. For 70 years, the story that we told about ourselves as a society and a nation held good. It percolated down, it kept us secure. Today, that storytelling about a plural and diverse nation has weakened for many, many reasons that I don't have time to expand on today. Mr. Modi is now telling a story that is much more compelling. Nobody's testing him on the facts yet. It's just that his plot line is more exciting. So the great challenge now for those of us who believe in a more plural and diverse idea of the nation is to come up with a new story, to tell a story that will be more compelling when people are ready to hear it. It's very interesting that in India, we have so far, the liberal elite, stayed away from the idea of Hinduism. I'll just give you one story. The most conflicting, culturally tense situation in India right now is about the temple for Lord Ram. All ideas of dominance over minorities, whether Muslims or Christians, is mostly mediated through the idea of Lord Ram. We want to build a temple where we believe it was the birthplace of Ram, because when the Mughal Emperor Babur came into India, people believed that his general broke a temple and raised a mosque over there. Many of you might be familiar that that mosque was broken, and now there's a big legal case over whether a temple can come up in that spot. For the longest time, liberal elites stayed away from any discussion about Ram. People like me would be ashamed to engage in that conversation. Today, the challenge for us is to go back to our cultural heritage and to look for stories of liberalism, to retrieve and rescue Ram from the Hindutva project, because they have turned it into a political project, whereas Ram is the idea of the ideal king. So we have to engage in that cultural conversation, not stay away from it. Perhaps the time has come to think deeply about this third path to modernity and nationalism that was once available to India, an updated version of the path suggested by Gandhi and Tagore. Before the colonial encounter, India already had roots in the modern, in its many cultural streams. There were spaces for atheists, like the Charvakas within our religious traditions. There were reform movements like Buddhism and Jainism and the Bhaktis and the Sufis. There was an intense engagement with science and maths and cosmology. There were robust traditions of dissent and powerful characters of women. There were alternate models of politics and economics. In this third phase of modernity, we will have to go back and look for symbols to hold liberal values in our own cultural heritage. We can no longer borrow it from Europe and Britain and America and hope to win. Our liberal values, our commitments to plurality and diversity, the right to dissent, the sanctity of minorities, needs a much more inspired, salty, earthy, homegrown language. There are writers who are doing this. In the past, we had a very interesting sociologist called Ashish Nandi, who spoke about the defeated cultures of the tropics. Why does India, Why does Morocco? Why do all developing countries only look to the West? Why are we not speaking with each other? The culture of the tropics. Your country, it has an ancient history. It has been the pathway for many different cultures, for many incidents of history. It is a place where many continents meet, the African character, the Arab character, the European character. Why are we not in dialogue with each other? Why are we not in dialogue with Asian cultures, with Japan and with China? Why are we not trying to retrieve our own identity, our own capacity for modernity? In India today, there are some young writers who are beginning this important project. When they speak of liberal values, they draw beautiful, emotionally resonant stories from our own cultures, from our own epics, hidden characters that we had forgotten. This has much more emotional resonance. If we want to fight Hindu majoritarianism, it has to be a battle fought by Hindus themselves. Much as Islam is a battle between Islamists and Muslims and Islam, in India, we have begun to recognize that this is not a battle between Hindus and Muslims, it is a battle between Hindus and the Hindutva, Hindu right wing. So to challenge the 19th century idea of nationalism, the Italian, Germanic idea of nation state, the Hitler and Mussolini idea of societies, presented by the BJP, packaged in 21st century technology, Indian liberals will have to come up with something more authentically Indian and exciting. We need to come up with an idea of modernity that is AI-enabled and yet, as I said, draws on stories and metaphors and myths within our own cultural and religious traditions. This is not just a battle of minds, it's a battle for the hearts and imagination of Indian people. It's early days yet. Phase 2 of India's dialogue with modernity has just begun. Mr. Modi and the BJP's political genius lay in integrating India's emotional makeup with its hungry economic ambition and its desire for modernity. But the economy has been on a downslide this year, and Mr. Modi may not be able to deliver on the shiny dreams he has promised. And again, I'll reiterate, many things that he's doing are positive. They are lessons that we need to take. And he undoubtedly has a long rope still. But if he doesn't deliver on the modern dream, at some point, restlessness will begin to set in. That's when the space will open up for phase 3 of India's tryst with modernity. Perhaps we will have arrived at the correct physical and mental model by then. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا للسيدة المحاضرة شوما شودري على محاضرتها القيمة حول الانقسام الذاتي، حوارات الهند مع الحداثة. لقد استهلت السيدة المحاضرة بتحليل التمازج بين الحداثة والتقليد، وأكدت على أن التحدي الثقافي للمجتمع هو الذي يساعد على هذا التمازج. كما أشارت إلى أن المغرب كما هو الشأن بالنسبة للهند يتطلع للتحويل والتحديث، وأن الثقة في النفس جعلت المواطن الهندي يتطلع للحداثة. كما أشارت كذلك أن على الهند أن تبتعد عن المركز وتقترب من القرى والبوادي التي بقيت على حافة الحداثة، وأن هذه الفئة لم تستفد ولم تلج الحداثة. كما أشارت إلى أن الهند تمر اليوم بفترة من المتغيرات والمستجدات المتنامية، كما قامت بتحليل المعادلات الصعبة التي تعيشها الهند كمكانة المرأة في المجتمع، والعلاقات بين الآباء والأبناء والتأكيدات الثقافية، وانهيار الأفكار والقيم القديمة، وإعادة النظر في المشروع القومي، كما وقفت على الخصائص الجديدة للمجتمع في خضم التطور الديناميكي. الآن نفتح باب المناقشة لعرض بعض المداخلات في حدود 3 على الأكثر، وأؤكد على ضرورة اتسام هذه المداخلات بالتركيز والاختصار.
Thank you so much for this fascinating lecture, and when I say fascinating, I really mean it. As modernity has to do in a way or another with history, could you elaborate on Indians' perception of their 19th century past? I'm alluding in particular to the Indian Mutiny, or what you call the First War of Independence, and the role of modern tools, namely telegraph and new rifles and ammunition, in the crackdown of this uprising of Hindus and Muslims as well against British colonial rule. Thank you.
شكرا. لست أدري إن كانت الترجمة غادي تكون من العربية الإنجليزية متاحة أم لا. متاحة، ممتاز. بغيت قبل المداخلة ديالي نشير إلى أنه كان عندي واحد الإحساس وبأن المحاضر غادي يكون منسجم متناغم مع داكشي اللي كنفكر فيه منذ زمن طويل على موضوع الحداثة. لهذا كتبت رسالة إيميل كنشكر السيد الأمين سير الدائم للمملكة المغربية لأكاديمية المملكة المغربية على الدعوة بحضور هذه المحاضرة القيمة جدا التي أعجبتني في شكلها ومضمونها، حيث أغنتها بمصطلحات جديدة مثل الحداثة العضوية ومسألة ديال الثقافة ديال دول المدار التروبيك. وبهذه المناسبة نقول لها بأنه احنا معاه في هذا الحوار والتكاتف الجهود ديال النخب المتنورة لشرح هذا المفهوم هذا، لأنه مفهوم صعب الاستيعاب ديالو من طرف المجتمع. لهذا حتى عندما سمعت المسألة ديال التماجز ما بين التقليد والحداثة أنا أفضل التصالح. لماذا؟ لأنه التصالح يعني اعتراف المجتمع بمشروعية الأزمنة الحديثة. لما كانش هذا الاعتراف هذا غادي يكون احترام متبادل وتقدير، لأن حتى كاين مشروعية تاريخية للتقاليد، وهذا شيء أساسي. وأنا تنحية مرة أخرى السيدة المحاضرة على المحاضرة ديالها وتحملها عناء السفر من الهند إلى المغرب رغم طول المسافة، وأنا معها في هذا الخندق ديال الحداثة المتنورة. وشكرا.
Thank you for your comments. In answer to your question about the Indian uprising, the first war of independence as we call it, it had actually a very difficult impact on India because it was uprising in which Hindus and Muslims both participated. And it was a good direction for the Indian independence movement to take. But what the British did in response was to create a rupture. It created a division between Hindus and Muslims. And it realized that the real challenge to colonialism would come if the communities came together. And so the First War of Independence, in a way, became the seed for what would eventually lead to partition. And the psychological impact of that continues even till today. I'm still hopeful that in this new phase of modernity as I speak, Hindus and Muslims will begin to come together in a new way because the new generation does not remember partition. It is not so painful for them to think of their identities as coming together. And the third force that is impacting India today is consumerism. Regardless of which religion or caste or community, the young are hungry for material well-being, for jobs, for a capacity to buy things. And that itself is making the Modernity project move forward. Because of those reasons, I think that the impact of that split in Hindu and Muslim psyche will begin to come together. Mr. Modi is very interesting because even as he is at one level creating a rift, at another level he's challenging the Muslim community to begin to join the modern mainstream. And I think that that is something liberals should have done much earlier, to have the courage to speak to the progressive aspects of Muslim community rather than keep them imprisoned in its most regressive facets. So there's an interesting dynamic going on in India regarding that. So I'm not sure there was a question, you were merely making a comment. I put this up.
أجدد الشكر للسيدة الأستاذة شوما شودري على محاضرتها القيمة، ونتمنى أن تكون هذه المحاضرة فاتحة مساهمات أخرى في أنشطة الأكاديمية، سواء على صعيد المحاضرات أو الندوات أو الدورات. أشكركم حضرات السيدات والسادة على تلبيتكم لدعوة الأكاديمية وتتبع أنشطتها الثقافية، وإلى اللقاء إن شاء الله في نشاط علمي آخر، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته.